The storm did not arrive with the usual warning signs of a natural disaster. There were no dark clouds gathering on the horizon, no distant rumble of thunder. Instead, the sky simply changed. One moment, it was a clear autumn evening, the stars twinkling faintly above the town. The next, the heavens were consumed by a swirling, luminescent haze of blue. It was as if the fabric of the sky had been torn open, revealing something alien and incomprehensible. Townsfolk of Lubeck gathered in the streets, their faces bathed in the unnatural glow. Children pointed and laughed, thinking it some kind of celestial fireworks display. But the adults felt deep, primal unease. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying with it metallic scent that made teeth ache and skin crawl. The wind, when it came, was not the crisp autumn breeze they were accustomed to. It was warm and damp, like the breath of some great beast. And then the lightning began. Bolts of blue lightning were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. They did not streak across the sky in jagged lines, but instead seemed to flow like liquid fire, arcing gracefully from cloud to cloud before striking the ground with sound that was less crack of thunder and more high-pitched shriek. Each strike left behind crater of glowing, molten earth, and wherever the lightning touched, it ignited blue flames that burned with an intensity that defied logic. The flames were the first sign that the storm was not of this world. It did not behave like ordinary fire. They moved with purpose, curling and twisting like serpents, seeking out anything, or anyone, that crossed their path. Water did not extinguish them. If anything, it made them burn brighter. And when the flames consumed living thing, the result was horrifying. The blue fire was alive. This was the only explanation that made sense to those who witnessed its behavior. It did not simply burn. It fed. When it enveloped person, it did not kill them immediately. Instead, it seemed to savor their agony, consuming them slowly, layer by layer. A victim's screams were unlike anything the townsfolk had ever heard. Mixture of pain, terror, and something else, something almost ecstatic. Those who were caught in the flames but managed to escape were left with horrific injuries. Their skin was charred and blackened, but it glowed faintly, as if the fire had left some part of itself behind. These survivors were cursed, their bodies slowly wasting away as the blue energy consumed them from within. They became known as the Timberfolk, and their presence was a constant reminder of the storm's power. As the storm raged on, the blue mist that had accompanied its arrival began to thicken, spreading through the streets and into the homes of Lubeck. The miasma was more than just physical phenomenon. It was living, breathing, entity manifestation of the storm's malevolent will. Those who inhaled it experienced vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Some saw their loved ones transformed into monstrous creatures, while others were forced to relive their darkest memories. The miasma had a particularly devastating effect on the mind. It stripped away reason and restraint, leaving only raw, primal emotion. Friends turned on each other, families were torn apart, and the streets ran red with blood. Those who succumbed completely to the miasma became part of the storm itself, their bodies dissolving into the mist, their faces appearing briefly in the swirling clouds before vanishing forever. Not all who were touched by the storm died, were transformed, their bodies warped and twisted by the blue energy. These unfortunate souls became known as the Shimmering Ones, and they were both pitied and feared. Their skin glowed faintly, and their veins pulsed with a blue light. Their bodies were contorted into grotesque, inhuman shapes, with extra limbs, jagged crystalline growths, and eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The Shimmering Ones were driven mad by their transformation, their minds consumed by the storm's influence. They roamed the streets, attacking anyone who crossed their path, their movements jerky and erratic. Some still retained fragments of their former selves, and their cries of anguish were a haunting reminder of the humanity they had lost. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the storm was not a random act of nature. It had purpose, though what that purpose was remained mystery. Some believed it was punishment, divine retribution for the town's sins. Others thought it was an invasion, the first wave of an attack by some alien force. Johann, the scientist, had a different theory. He believed that the storm was the result of an ancient, long-dormant power that had been awakened by human interference. Deep within the forest, he theorized, lay an artifact of immense power. Relic from time before recorded history, when the world was a very different place. The storm, he argued, was defense mechanism, way for the artifact to protect itself from those who would seek to control. At the heart of the storm was a place of calm, eerie, unnatural stillness where the wind did not blow and the lightning did not strike. This was the eye, and it was here that the true nature of the storm could be seen. The air was thick with the blue mist, and the ground was littered with the remains of those who had been consumed by the storm. At the center of the eye was massive, pulsating crystal, its surface covered in intricate, glowing runes. The crystal was the source of the storm's power, and it radiated an energy that was both beautiful and terrifying. Those who approached it felt a strange pull, as if the crystal was calling to them, inviting them to touch it, to become one with it. But to do so was to risk losing oneself completely, to become another victim of the storm's insatiable hunger. The storm struck without warning, and its first victims were those who happened to be outside when the blue lightning began to fall. These individuals, ordinary townsfolk going about their lives, became harbingers of the terror that was to come. Their deaths were not quick or merciful. They were brutal, grotesque, and deeply unsettling, leaving an indelible mark on the survivors who witnessed them. Hans Muller was a burly, kind-hearted man who had been the town's blacksmith for over 2 decades. He was well loved for his skill and generosity, often repairing tools and horseshoes for free for those who couldn't afford to pay. On the evening the storm arrived, Hans had been working late in his forge, hammering out a new set of hinges for the church doors. When the first bolt of blue lightning struck the church steeple, Hans was one of the first to rush outside to see what was happening. The sight of the blue flames consuming the steeple filled him with dread, but Hans was not one to stand by while his town burned. Grabbing a bucket, he ran toward the church, shouting for others to join him. It was then that the second bolt struck. The lightning hit Hans directly in the chest, lifting him off his feet and suspending him in the air for a moment before hurling him to the ground. His body convulsed violently, his muscles contracting so forcefully that bones snapped audibly. His skin turned ashen, and his veins bulged, blackening as if filled with ink. His eyes, wide with terror, burst like overripe fruit, and thick, oily substance oozed from his mouth and nose. By the time his body hit the ground, it was already crumbling into ash, leaving behind only faintly glowing outline of where he had fallen. The townsfolk who had gathered to help were frozen in horror. Some vomited, while others fell to their knees, praying for deliverance. Hans's death was a grim omen, sign that the storm was not merely destructive, but malevolent. Father Reinhardt had been the spiritual leader of Lubeck for as long as anyone could remember. Gentle, devout man, he was known for his compassion and his unwavering faith. When the storm struck the church steeple, Father Reinhardt was inside, preparing for evening prayers. He rushed out to see what was happening, his robes billowing in the unnatural wind. The sight of the blue flames consuming his beloved church filled him with despair, but he refused to abandon his flock. Standing in the square, he raised his arms and called out to the townsfolk, urging them to remain calm and trust in God's plan. It was then that the miasma reached him. The blue mist curled around Father Reinhardt like a living thing, seeping into his lungs and filling his mind with visions of unimaginable horror. He saw his congregation transformed into monstrous creatures, their faces twisted in agony as they begged him for salvation. He saw the church collapse, and on itself the cross atop, the steeple melting into a pool of glowing liquid. And he saw himself standing at the center of it all, his hands dripping with blood. The visions broke him. Father Reinhardt began to scream, tearing at his robes and clawing at his face. His eyes turned black, and his skin began to peel away, revealing the glowing blue energy beneath. He collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing as the miasma consumed him. By the time it was over, there was nothing left of Father Reinhardt but a pile of ash and the faint echo of his final, anguished prayer. Not all of the storm's victims died immediately. Some were left in a state of agonizing limbo, their bodies consumed by the blue fire but their minds still intact. These individuals became known as the Emberfolk, and their existence was a living nightmare. One of the first Emberfolk was Marta, widow who had been tending her garden when the storm struck. A bolt of blue lightning grazed her arm, igniting her sleeve and spreading rapidly across her body. The fire burned away her flesh but left her skeleton intact, glowing faintly with blue energy. Marta was still alive, her mind trapped within the charred remains of her body. She could feel every moment of her agony, but she could not scream, could not move, could not die. She wandered the streets, silent, flickering specter, her presence constant reminder of the storm's cruelty. The Emberfolk were shunned by the survivors, who feared that their touch would spread the blue fire. But some light, beyond the scientists, saw them as a tragic symbol of the storm's power, warning of what could happen if the storm was not stopped. The miasma was the storm's breath, thick, suffocating fog that rolled through the streets of Lubeck like a living thing. It was not merely a physical phenomenon, it was manifestation of the storm's malevolent will, tool of terror and transformation. The mist glowed faintly, casting an eerie blue light over everything it touched, and it carried with it metal, scent that made throats burn and eyes water. But the true horror of the miasma lay in its effects on those who breathed it in. The miasma arrived shortly after the first bolts of blue lightning struck. It crept over the horizon like tidal wave, swallowing the landscape in its luminescent glow. The townsfolk watched in awe and terror as it rolled through the streets, seeping into homes through cracks and crevices, filling lungs and minds with its poison. At first, the mist seemed harmless, even beautiful. Children reached out to touch it, marveling at the way it swirled and danced around their fingers. But the adults felt a deep primal unease. The air grew heavy and oppressive, and the metallic scent grew stronger, making it difficult to breathe. Those who inhaled the mist felt a strange tingling sensation in their chests, as if something foreign had taken root inside them. The miasma's most immediate and devastating act was its ability to induce vivid, terrifying hallucinations. These were not mere figments of the imagination. They were visceral, all-consuming experiences that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Elsa, a young woman who had lost her family to the storm, was one of the first to experience the miasma's hallucinations. As the mist enveloped her, she found herself standing in the ruins of her home. The walls were charred and crumbling, and the air was thick with the smell of burning flesh. She saw her husband and children, their bodies twisted and broken, crawling toward her with outstretched hands. Their eyes were black voids, and their mouths moved soundlessly, as if begging for help. Elsa tried to run, but the walls of the house seemed to close in around her, trapping her in nightmare from which she could not wake. Klaus, the grizzled hunter, was no stranger to danger, but even he was not prepared for the horrors the miasma unleashed. As he inhaled the mist, he found himself back in the forest, surrounded by the glowing, twisted forms of the shimmering ones. They moved with unnatural speed, their glowing eyes fixed on him as they closed in. Klaus raised his rifle, but the weapon dissolved into mist in his hands. The creatures lunged at him, their claws tearing into his flesh, but when he looked down, he saw that it was not his own blood that flowed from the wounds. It was thick, glowing blue liquid that burned like acid. Johann, the scientist, prided himself on his rationality and skepticism, but even he was not immune to the miasma's effects. As he breathed in the mist, he found himself in vast, endless voids, surrounded by swirling clouds of blue light. The light coalesced into shapes, faces, bodies, landscapes that shifted and morphed before his eyes. He heard voices whispering in his mind, promising him knowledge and power if he would only submit to the storm's will. Johann tried to resist, but the voices grew louder, more insistent, until he could no longer tell where his own thoughts ended and the miasma's influence began. The miasma did not merely affect the mind. It also wreaked havoc on the body. Those who breathed it in for too long began to experience a range of horrifying symptoms. The first sign of the miasma's physical effects was dry, hacking cough that seemed to come from deep within the chest. The cough grew worse, over time, becoming so violent that it caused ribs to crack and lungs to bleed. Some victims coughed up thick, black mucus that glowed faintly in the dark. As the miasma took hold, the skin of those affected began to glow faintly, as if the mist had seeped into their veins. The glow started as faint blue light beneath the skin, but grew brighter over time until the victims' bodies were illuminated from within. This glow was accompanied by burning sensation, as if mist was consuming them from the inside out. In the most severe cases, the miasma caused complete physical transformation. The victims' bodies twisted and contorted, their bones snapping and reforming into grotesque, inhuman shapes. Their skin split open, revealing glowing blue veins and jagged crystalline growths that pierced their flesh from within. These individuals became the shimmering ones, their minds consumed by the storm's influence and their bodies turned into weapons of destruction. The miasma was not a random byproduct of the storm. It was a tool, means of spreading fear and chaos. It sought out those who were weak-willed or vulnerable, breaking their minds and bodies and turning them into agents of the storm's will. The mist was drawn to strong emotions, feeding on fear, anger, and despair. It amplified these emotions, creating a feedback loop that drove its victims to madness. The miasma also served as means of communication, carrying Storm's voice to those who were susceptible to its influence. The whispers that Johann heard were not mere hallucinations. They were the storm itself, speaking directly to him, trying to bend him to its will. The survivors of Lubeck quickly learned to fear the miasma. They sealed their homes as best they could, using wet cloths and tar to block the cracks and crevices through which the mist could seep. But the miasma was relentless, and no barrier was completely effective. Those who ventured outside wore crude masks made of cloth and charcoal, but even these offered only limited protection. The miasma became a constant presence in the survivors' lives, a reminder of the storm's power and the fragility of their existence. It was a force of nature, but it was also something more. Living malevolent entity that sought to consume everything in its path. The shimmering ones were once ordinary people. Neighbors, friends, family members. But the storm changed them, twisting their bodies and minds into something unrecognizable. They became grotesque, glowing abominations, their humanity stripped away and replaced by the storm's malevolent energy. The townsfolk of Lubeck feared and pitied them in equal measure, for the shimmering ones were both threat and tragic reminder of what the storm could do. The transformation into a shimmering one began with exposure to the storm's energy, whether through direct contact with the blue lightning, prolonged inhalation of the miasma, or proximity to the storm's source. The process was not instantaneous. It was slow, agonizing descent into inhumanity. The first sign of transformation was faint, blue glow beneath the skin. This glow was accompanied by burning sensation, as if the victim's veins were filled with liquid fire. The glow grew brighter over time, pulsing in time with the victim's heartbeat. As the storm's energy spread through the body, the victim experienced excruciating pain. Bones cracked and reformed, muscles twisted and contorted, and skin split open to reveal glowing blue veins and jagged crystalline growths. The pain was so intense that many victims begged for death, but the storm kept them alive, forcing them to endure every moment of their transformation. The final stage of transformation was the most horrifying. The victim's body became unrecognizable, warped into grotesque, inhuman shape. Some grew extra limbs, while others sprouted jagged, crystalline protrusions that pierced their flesh from within. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their movements became jerky and erratic, as if they were no longer in control of their own bodies. No two shimmering ones looked exactly alike, but they all shared certain characteristics. Their skin glowed faintly, as if lit from within by the storm's energy. The glow was brightest around their veins, which pulsed with blue light. Jagged, crystalline growths erupted from their bodies, piercing their flesh and forming kind of natural armor. These growths were sharp and brittle, shattering easily but causing horrific injuries to anyone who came into contact with them. Their faces were often the most disturbing part of their appearance. Some had extra eyes, while others had mouths that stretched too wide or too many teeth. Their expressions were frozen in masks of agony or rage, a reflection of the torment they endured. The shimmering ones moved in ways that defied the laws of physics. They could twist and contort their bodies in impossible ways, and their movements were often jerky and erratic, as if they were being controlled by some external force. The shimmering ones were not mindless monsters. They were still aware, on some level, of what they had become, but their minds had been shattered by the storm's energy, leaving them trapped in a state of constant agony and confusion. Some shimmering ones retained fragments of their former lives, but these memories were distorted and fragmented. They might recognize loved one, but only as target for their rage or source of pain. The storm's energy filled their minds with whispers and screams, a cacophony of voices that drove them to madness. These voices urged them to destroy, to spread the storm's influence, to turn others into shimmering ones. In rare moments of clarity, the shimmering ones were aware of what they had become and what they were doing. These moments were the most torturous of all, as they realized the extent of their suffering and the harm they were causing to others. The shimmering ones were driven by a combination of instinct and the storm's influence. They were drawn to sources of strong emotion, particularly fear and anger, and they attacked without warning or mercy. The shimmering ones often hunted in packs, using their unnatural speed and agility to surround and overwhelm their prey. They communicated with each other through guttural growls and eerie, high-pitched screams. The shimmering ones were not just victims of the storm. They were also its agents. Their touch could spread the storm's energy, turning others into shimmering ones or infecting them with the miasma. Some shimmering ones seemed to take pleasure in this, deliberately seeking out survivors to infect. The shimmering ones were particularly drawn to the living, as if they resented those who had not yet been transformed. They attacked with ferocity that was both terrifying and pitiful, their glowing eyes filled with mixture of rage and despair. Greta was one of the first shimmering ones, transformed after being struck by a droplet of glowing water from the fountain in the square. Her body was twisted and distorted, but she still wore the tattered remains of her dress, haunting reminder of the child she had once been. Greta's attacks were particularly brutal, as if she was trying to punish the world for what had been done to her. Hans's transformation was incomplete, leaving him trapped in a state between life and death. His body was partially consumed by the blue fire, leaving him flickering, skeletal figure. Hans was one of the few shimmering ones who retained some semblance of his former self, and he often appeared at the edges of the survivors' camp, watching them with glowing eyes filled with sorrow. The priest's transformation was one of the most tragic. His body was covered in jagged, crystalline growths that resembled crown of thorns, and his eyes burned with an unnatural light. Father Reinhardt's attacks were accompanied by distorted prayers and hymns, as if he was trying to absolve himself of the sins he was committing. The survivors of Lubeck feared and pitied the shimmering ones in equal measure. Some saw them as monsters to be destroyed, while others saw them as tragic victims who deserved mercy. This divide often led to conflict within the group as they struggled to decide how to deal with the shimmering ones. Some survivors formed hunting parties to track down and kill the shimmering ones. These hunts were dangerous and often ended in tragedy, as the shimmering ones were far more powerful than they appeared. Others, like Johann the Scientist, believed that the shimmering ones could be saved. They experimented with ways to reverse the transformation, but their efforts were met with little success. The storm's energy was too deeply ingrained in the shimmering ones' bodies and minds to be removed. The survivors rebuilt what they could, but the memory of the storm lingered like a shadow. The forest remained a place of fear and mystery, and the townsfolk whispered of the blue flames that still flickered in the darkest corners of the town. And though the storm was gone, they knew that the artifact, or something like it, could one day return.